Hi everyone, Blind Dweller here. Today we return ourselves again to the life and artwork of Francis Bacon with part 3 of the Tainted Talent series. By now, Francis is an established artist, now nearly famous on a global scale, but with the extra attention from art fanatics came the extra attention of certain people who would impact Francis on a more personal level, and in so doing, would impact the meanings and concepts in his paintings. Today we explore the more personal side of Francis Bacon's life, as well as the people closest to him, after the unfortunate death of his former nanny and mentor, Nanny Lightfoot. If you just stumbled across this channel and this video and you're wondering what on earth I'm chatting about, please stop this video now, and I urge you to give parts 1 and 2 a watch first before proceeding with this episode, just so that you're up to speed with the documentary, as it's still currently an ongoing series at the time of posting this video. I'd like to give a huge thank you once again to everyone who has watched and supported the series so far, and I thoroughly hope you enjoyed today's chapter. And with that said, welcome to another video. Today, we explore part 3 of the story and artwork of Francis Bacon. Possibly in the midst of one of Francis Bacon's cocktail and champagne-fueled nights out in the sleepless streets of Soho in London is when and where he would meet an attractive and well-dressed 36-year-old man playing the piano in one of the many Soho jazz clubs named Peter Lacy. There is quite a surprising amount of misinformation surrounding Lacy that I discovered whilst researching for this video. For example, I mentioned earlier that Lacy was a former Spitfire pilot during the Battle of Britain. But despite this, and this very convincing photograph of Lacy, I'm afraid I must now confess that this was only a myth and illusion that surrounded him for many years during and after his death. The truth is, Lacy began in aircraft production rather than piloting any kind of plane, and would only join the RAF after the Battle of Britain in 1941, after the forces needed to recruit more into their ranks. But even then, Lacy would not fly any Spitfire or engage in any type of combat. Instead, he would work as a mechanic and occasional test pilot for the twin-engine Wellington bombers. However, one aspect that added fire to the rumour was much like in this photograph. Lacy looked the part of a Spitfire pilot. He was reserved, had a slight stammer, and had an almost nervous demeanour, but was also fair, tall, witty when encouraged to be, smartly dressed, and had what Francis described as an extraordinary physique, once stating that even Lacy's thighs were beautiful. This kind of language from Bacon was practically unheard of to his closest friends, with Bacon often brushing such weak emotions like love aside. Love was a word he would often stick in between quotation marks and even describe it as being an illness. But regardless, there was no denying that Francis was well and truly in love with this new quiet man named Lacy. Perhaps when they met, and Francis would discover Lacy's shockingly similar childhood and background, that it would create a rare spark within Francis to explore deeper into the strange man's life. Lacy was born in Leamington Spa, in England in 1916. He too, like Francis, was raised in a strict, traditional Edwardian Catholic household. He was the youngest of 3 children. His siblings were an older brother, Anthony, and an older sister named Joan. Lacy's youth seemed fairly ordinary and happy. He was athletic, skilled at tennis, and excelled at the piano, and would later develop a keen interest in motorcars and mechanics, which would earn pride from his family, who possessed a lucrative background within engineering. By the time he reached adolescence, however, he began to learn and accept his homosexuality, which of course his Catholic family would not only consider an outrage, but also an unforgivable sin within the eyes of God. His parents would even refer to homosexuality as an illness. Because of this, Peter would spend his teens, and indeed the majority of his life, as closeted, confused, and bitterly frustrated. He maintained a very straightforward and masculine appearance on the surface, but nonetheless began to enjoy more activities that his family thought were less conventional, such as jazz music and the theatre. Lacy would struggle to find work after dropping out of education, until the arrival of World War II, when Lacy would land work at an engineering firm that manufactured aircraft engines. By 1941, Lacy signed up for the RAF, specialising in aircraft maintenance. He would then finally train as a pilot, rising up the ranks to eventually become pilot officer, a rank equivalent to lieutenant in the army. He would not pursue a long career in the RAF, however, as by the time the war had ended, Lacy left the forces and went back to more years of living off family wealth. Lacy would inherit a substantial fortune with his siblings after their father passed away. Lacy would move to London after months abroad in Barbados, landing himself a job as a pianist in the Soho nightclubs, where his story would intertwine with that of Bacon's, who too was in a vulnerable period after losing his lifelong advisor and carer, Nanny Lightfoot. Although on the surface it seemed a perfect match of two souls who struggled with their upbringing, finally finding each other and falling in love, even their closest circles would begin to notice that this was not an ordinary romantic relationship, at least not in the conventional sense of the word. Such a clash in personalities and repressed frustrations would cause them to argue and row with each other frequently, and often violently. Bacon would often now shy away from describing Lacy as an amusing man in his life, which, in truth, was not just around his pleasant, reserved qualities. Bacon also had an avid fascination in the most primal and animalistic side of humanity, which included violence, mischief, and sexual ferocity. Lacy was already a man burdened with a quick temper since his teen years, but Francis admitted to finding quiet satisfaction in provoking Lacy. He knew which buttons to press, and Francis was both terrified and enamored by Lacy at his most violent. Francis would often openly admit to people that he enjoyed sadism and masochism, but often it would go far beyond a mere fetish, with Francis often encouraging or goading Lacy to beat, kick, flog, or ravage him. But even when Francis succeeded, he did not expect to see what Lacy was truly capable of. The beatings were fueled with hate rather than just passion. In Francis Bacon Revelations, it documents a conversation that Francis had with a stranger when travelling with Lacy one time to South Africa. Lacy was apparently drunk the entire trip and was being violent to other passengers on their cruise ship. The stranger asked, "Who's that awful man you're with?" And Francis, of course, could only answer, "Well, I don't really know." As Bacon and Lacy continued to travel and live together, their violent clashes only intensified. In the same year they first met, Lacy one day turned to Francis, inviting him to stay at his property in Berkshire called Long Cottage in Hurst. The exchange is documented as follows. "Leave your painting and come live with me," Lacy said. "What does living with you mean?" Francis would reply. "Well," said Lacy, "you can live in the corner of my cottage on straw. You can sleep and there. I can chain you to the wall," he might have also said, according to Michael Peppiatt in the Francis Bacon documentary, A Brush with Violence. What would truly reveal the full extent of the brutality of their relationship, though, was a row at the same cottage that subsequently ended with Lacy throwing Francis out of a window, causing him to fall up to 15 feet below in a cloud of broken glass. Francis was apparently heavily intoxicated and claimed he felt little pain, but the fall still left him with many lacerations on his face. Francis would describe Lacy as frightful or awful when asked about him. He may have genuinely felt this way, but don't forget that such words and concepts were not necessarily considered totally negative to Bacon, at times quite the opposite. As well as fulfilling arguably unhealthy fantasies, he was also, perhaps subconsciously, obtaining bountiful inspiration for paintings released during the 50s that were now beginning to delve in both different styles and moods, from the bright, beautiful, and optimistic, to the dark, ugly, and brutal. Although Lacy, it would seem, would never be one of Francis Bacon's art fans as well as a lover, Bacon did nonetheless continue to paint, often still leaving it very last minute before his next opening, with drinking, gambling, and basically getting laid in between. In 1953, artist and good friend to Francis, Lucian Freud, would purchase a painting called Two Figures, or otherwise known as The Wrestlers, or otherwise known by the somewhat more crude title, The Buggers. For anyone who is not British and doesn't know what that means, for once I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to Google that one. Regardless of what this painting is called, it's considered by many to be another of Bacon's most fascinating paintings, displaying two men intertwined with each other, inspired once again from the still images and photographs Bacon had in his collection, possibly directly from his copy of Human Figure in Motion. Freud, much like Bacon, was obsessed in sexual encounters and somewhat promiscuous, but not homosexual himself. But perhaps he shared an energy with Bacon from a dramatic and violent-looking moment of passion that Bacon captures in this painting that encouraged Freud to buy the painting and even hang it above his bed. Whether it was inspired by a real incident between Bacon and Lacy is still a matter of debate, but regardless, it's nonetheless a perfect window into Bacon's fantasies and more intimate side of his lifestyle. There's also a slight sense of dark humour and rebelliousness in the painting, perhaps due to the fact that such a display would be released to a public very much still repulsed by gay men, with arrests of homosexuals in the 50s now sadly becoming more frequent. Although Francis was not massively open about his sexuality, he did not hide it either, at least not how he used to in his youth. Such a personality would require a huge amount of risk for a person to maintain in such a society, but as we know, risk virtually ran and motivated Bacon's life. By 1957, there would be an interesting period when Francis would experiment with yet another famous artist's style and medium. This time that of Vincent van Gogh, or Vincent van Gogh if you want to try pronouncing it correctly, but there's no way I'm confident enough to try that more than once. In March of that year, during another of Bacon's exhibitions at the Hanover Gallery, the public were presented with 6 paintings containing surprisingly dazzling and harmonious colours than what Bacon normally delivers, which he explained were inspired by the now sadly destroyed painting called The Painter on the Road to Tarascon. This was painted by Van Gogh roughly in 1888, but was eventually lost in a fire from the bombings of Magdeburg during World War II. Bacon's versions of a painting is distinctive to that of Van Gogh, almost with his use of multiple layers of colour, a style unique to that of Van Gogh in the way that he saw the world around him, supposedly due to colour blindness. However, Bacon still adds and subtracts from the original, blending in his own style with more surreal choices of colour, more solemn-looking figures, and thicker applications of oil paint, almost exaggerating the style of Van Gogh as a result. But nonetheless, Bacon is beautifully and sensitively honouring the original artist in these paintings, and showing yet another fascinating example of Bacon's drive to keep experimenting with his capabilities as a painter. This would not be the only transition Francis would make regarding his art. After many more periods of losing money to gambling, and exhibitions showcasing yet more rushed and last-minute paintings, which didn't lack quality but nonetheless underwhelmed most audiences, Francis would start a new chapter in his career. In October the following year of 1958, he signed a new contract with Marlborough Fine Arts after its directors had offered to take on the considerable debt of £1,242, a debt that Francis owed to the Hanover Gallery. Bacon would be watched by the eye of Marlborough's co-founder Frank Lloyd, and his day-to-day affairs were handled by the gallery's manager Valerie Beston, who would be a key advisor and friend to Bacon, whom he'd affectionately nickname Valerie from the Gallery. This new leaf turned over for Bacon, leading him and his painting into the 60s, would introduce gallery goers with something curiously familiar, yet also dramatically unexpected. By 1961, Francis would discover yet another London-based sanctuary for himself and his art. This time it would be at number 7 Rees Mews, a converted coach house in South Kensington, not too far away from his old home of Cromwell Place. This time, however, his new studio at Rees Mews, which was converted from the first floor of the building, would become very much a permanent part of Bacon's art career. Countless photographs of his studio space would be released to the press, of a cluttered, paint-splattered, chaotic room of photographs, easels, and canvases of all shapes and sizes. The idea of heaven for any artist, but of course due to Bacon's relentless asthma problems, the many layers of dust, debris, and noxious fumes from certain paints that would accumulate in the studio would irritate his condition from time to time. Even as Bacon grew older and worked in more studios over the years, it would be this one at Rhys Mews that Bacon could not resist but revisit whenever possible, right up to his dying days. The studio became Bacon's complete visual source of inspiration. Its heaps of torn photographs, fragments of illustrations, and artist catalogues provided nearly all of his visual sources, as by this time, he had all but given up painting from life modelling. By now, Bacon's art had become far more refined and improved in skill. Although Bacon would never admit to being good at drawing, the figures and the objects he would paint would still appear sharper, more expressive, more fluid, and his choice of colours were becoming more strident in range and hue. But something else had noticeably changed, something more malicious aside from his technique, which was his subject. The viewers could not help but notice a lot of his works in the late 50s and the early 60s were presenting the human form in a more violent and almost degrading way. Many figures would appear taken apart or disfigured, with body parts missing or hidden, or with existing body parts mutilated or damaged. Not too dissimilar from Picasso again, with a lot of examples to show for it, but in Bacon's art, the faces and the figures are made to look more pathetic and submissive, posed in unflattering positions, and unapologetically raw when delivering what they portray. Bacon's fascination in the animalistic side of human nature had transformed into something almost completely unhinged. One of the most defining insights into Bacon's state of mind during this time would be during his exhibition in 1962 at the Tate Gallery, with his painting titled 3 Studies for a Crucifixion. Here we are presented with a familiar fiery red-orange triptych, this time with a bright orange floor or carpet, with more crimson-coloured walls and black windows. Despite the similar colour scheme and title though, the message delivered in this particular triptych is arguably very different from his 1944 masterpiece. Also, this 1962 triptych would be colossal in size compared to that of his earlier work. A staggering 6.5 feet tall and nearly 15 feet long, twice the dimensions of his original 1944 triptych with its human figures depicted near life size. Let's start this time with the panel on the right, to help better explain a possible meaning behind this particular piece. Here we're presented with a carcass of meat, with remnants of human features interwoven with the meat. The carcass is either hanging from a meat hook on the ceiling, or is being crucified to an abstractly shaped throne or chair, with an equally abstract presentation of a silhouette of a dog overlooking the scene. The panel in the middle shows an even more graphic scene of countless blood splatters and exposed flesh and bone. Bacon himself would describe it as someone being shot to pieces on a bed. Finally, on the left, Bacon represents 2 viewers of these shocking displays, blended with shadow and even the background behind. The figure on the far left appears cheerless and almost disassociated with what he's witnessing, whilst the other is pointing enthusiastically towards the scenes beyond. So what could this triptych convey exactly? What was the driving force behind this brutal display of blood and violence? Well, returning us again to the authors of Francis Bacon Revelations, Mark Stevens and Annalyn Swan, Mark discusses the concept of sacrifice and humanity's reaction to it, being the main energy behind this concept. On the right-hand side panel, the sinuous mass of meat is in fact a form derived from a medieval 13th century crucifix by the Florentine artist Cimabue. The placement of the panels is crucial to the execution of the concept. Triptychs focused on the crucifixion would typically have the imagery of Jesus carrying the cross in the left panel. In the middle, it would contain imagery of Jesus being nailed to the cross, subsequently being the main focus of the piece. And finally, on the right, we'd typically be presented with Jesus being taken down from a cross. This was a popular subject for many artists in medieval Europe, especially during the 9th century. But what Francis displays here was far more substantial to the minds of viewers during this period. Moving the imagery of the crucifixion to the right, Francis chose the main focus, the central panel, to echo and replicate the existentialism brought on by the recent wars and destruction of the 20th century. His concept was that of total butchery. Francis chose the imagery of a meat carcass in a slaughterhouse as being crucified, specifically due to his personal belief that animals in slaughterhouses ultimately accept their fate, their sacrifice, as made further evident by the slabs of meat in the left panel. Seeing a parallel current in the human experience, as symbolized by the crucifixion, in that it represents the inevitability of death, Bacon would explain, "We are meat, we are potential carcasses." In a sense, the right panel is the embodiment of the modern-day sacrifice, the modern-day crucifixion, an example of what needs to die in order to maintain order or stability. In the middle panel, we are presented with yet another example of modern-day sacrifice, except this time it directly impacts the life of a human being. Although described as someone shot to pieces, there is a glimpse of a white dot that can be seen on the foot of a figure, which could be a nail akin to those used in a crucifixion. Mark Stevens described the technique applied in this panel by Bacon, such as the blood splatters and application of paint, as being very meticulous and almost joyful, as if Bacon truly had extreme pleasure and fun when creating a scene, despite how grotesque it may appear to an unsuspecting viewer. In the left panel, it focuses on the observers of sacrifice, the critics of the form, and possibly a representation of us looking at Bacon's art. As we know, Francis had a very love-hate relationship with art critics, a commentary that may have leaked into this panel, showing how such people react and visualize his work. But I do find the figure almost completely cloaked in the silhouette of a man's shadow deeply fascinating. It really does emphasize for me the notion of someone being physically there, yet being distant and vacant in such situations, almost an imitation of human emotion and interaction, not truly understanding what it is to be human, even when such visceral concepts are right there in front of them. Although interestingly enough, Michael Peppiatt in the Brush with Violence documentary believes the left panel to have a far more personal connection to Francis and his past, believing this to be an illustration of an authoritative figure ordering a smaller figure to leave, which could symbolize Bacon being rejected and thrown out of a family household when he was young. Three studies for figures at the base of a crucifixion, released in the mid-40s, may have kick-started Bacon's career, but by the time his 1962 triptych was released, Bacon was now recognised as a world-famous painter. Three Studies for a Crucifixion was exhibited alongside 90 other paintings at the Tate Gallery in May that year, and the reactions were monumental. Nearly 100,000 people had come to see Bacon at the Tate, and simultaneously he was receiving global recognition, with even his idol, Pablo Picasso, taking a liking to his work. Success must have felt exhilarating for Bacon at this time, if not for one tragic affair that would dilute the jovial fortune for Francis. On the exact same day as Bacon's opening day at the Tate, amidst telegrams congratulating Bacon, he had received one message that informed him of the death of his lover, Peter Lacy, who had died in Tangier in Morocco. A few years prior to his death, Bacon and Lacy were living apart from each other on and off. With Bacon's art on the rise, with Lacy deciding he had little desire to remain longer in England, and of course, due to the frequent domestic violence, Bacon would only live occasionally with Lacy in Africa, and Lacy only occasionally with Bacon in London. In Francis Bacon Revelations, Francis would recall one day during a visit to Lacy in Tangier. He arrived at Lacy's house and crossed paths with a local young man, apparently sitting up in a fig tree in the courtyard of a house. He asked me, Francis would say, whether he could pick figs, and in the end he climbed through the window and, well, he was terribly good looking. The forbidden fruit must be picked. This, as you can imagine, did not end well when Peter Lacy returned home and found the two men in bed together. Francis said he got, quote, absolutely mad. He went round and broke everything in the place. Francis would spend the rest of the evening sleeping on the beach, marking the dramatic and overdue end of their relationship. Sometime later after the breakup, Francis had freed himself from certain shackles, but he could not help but still care and think about Lacy. And by the time the news had reached him on the opening day that Lacy had died apparently due to alcohol consumption, Francis was deeply wounded and heartbroken. Even his friend Michael Pepiot would state that Francis was convinced Lacy had actually committed suicide due to the awful timing of Peter's death, which Francis was sure could not be mere coincidence, believing Lacy had deliberately timed his own death around Bacon's grand opening at the Tate. Francis would continue to smile and laugh along with the press and gallery visitors, but underneath, he was taken apart. In the following year of 1963, Francis would complete a now privately owned painting titled Landscape near Malabata, Tangier, one of my personal favourite Francis Bacon paintings, simply due to the fact that here we see the most guilty, the most fragile, and the most sensitive part of Francis Bacon's complicated personality. This painting, in short, was made in memory of Peter Lacy's final resting place. It's almost unclear to determine or decipher the shapes and the brushstrokes in this painting. The landscape is ambiguous, with swirling brushstrokes applied with emotional intensity. The lighting is also very sharp and dramatic, amplifying the surrealism of this piece. It's so mysterious, but that's what makes it so personal. Francis most likely painted only what made sense to him and Lacy, and created imagery that perfectly captures Bacon's rushing thoughts and fragmented feelings towards the death of his former lover. When I last went to see this painting for myself, it came with quite an interesting description on the concept of this painting as follows. A centrifugal rush recalls the speed of a greyhound track, although the foreground shape may relate to a photo Bacon kept of two animals in mortal combat. Captioned, while the owl tries to reach the snake's head, its legs become completely uncoiled. Outside of the painting, Bacon would begin his healing process in really the only way he knew how. He continued to live a nocturnal existence fueled by champagne and gambling in the luxurious house parties and London nightclubs. And so it would not be long till another curious individual would enter the painter's life. The rumoured story of how Francis Bacon and George Dyer started their romantic relationship is actually pretty humorous and melodramatic that is worth mentioning here. The story went, in late 1963, Bacon heard a crash and a commotion erupt from his art studio. A cat burglar had apparently smashed through the skylight and tumbled into the floor of the studio. Francis leapt into action and ran into the studio to confront the burglar. Francis would then strike a deal with the burglar. He must have sex with Francis now, or he shall report him to the police. This may have seemed like a popular myth due to the narrative focused on the relationship between a homosexual man and a criminal. The love affair of two types of men rejected from society, finding each other, and in so doing, a place of belonging, was an irresistible story to people at the time. Though over-exaggerated on how exactly they met, as always, there was always some truth to the story. What is confirmed is that Francis was burgled. It was reported that someone had broken into Bacon's studio through the skylight and had stolen two paintings. It is possible, but also very unlikely, that George Dyer was the burglar in question, and that the two came to know each other the following year. George definitely did come from a life of burglary and crime. He was a muscular, suit-wearing, stocky East End Londoner with a thick Cockney accent, who, according to Lucian Freud, met Francis at a club and went back to Rees Mews to play the game of Yahtzee. I'm joking, of course, so he obviously went back and did it. Francis was expecting just another one-night stand and possibly his watch being stolen, but instead, George gifted Francis with a gold watch, of which George had apparently stolen the night before. George grew up in a large, poor family, being one of 6 children who worked odd jobs usually involved in petty crime by the time he was old enough to work and provide for the household. His older half-brother, Ronnie, became good friends with the infamous London-based gangster duo and nightclub owners, the Cray Twins. He was tough, never turning down a fight, and always on the lookout for his younger siblings. He had a particular soft spot for his little brother, often referred to as Georgie, this being none other than George Dyer himself. Though according to the family and those closest to them, George was at first the least likely to ever be thought of as a dangerous criminal. As a boy, George was quiet, hardly caused any trouble at school, and had a sweet disposition, which would even continue into his adult life, known to many friends as someone very pleasant, almost very nice, unless of course you were ever to get on the wrong side of him. But Dyer's tough look only masked what Bacon would later weed out as something very unflattering. George had a depressive and insecure nature behind the intimidating front that he had adopted for himself. Sometimes George, much like Peter Lacy, had a stammer when he spoke, an uncontrollable temper, and sometimes struggled to hold eye contact in conversation. Bacon's sister, Ianthe, would recall hardly getting a word out of him when she met the East Ender herself. Though despite his shyness and what Bacon would describe as clumsiness, he still lived a social existence and successful life in crime, regularly attending nightclubs and making his living comfortable through thieving and burglary. George Dyer and those who knew him well claimed that he was not homosexual, but of course he could be accommodating, with one close friend stating that perhaps his homosexuality came from being in prison. Although many expected their fling just to remain as such, a relationship quickly bloomed between George and Francis. Despite sharing little in common, being from totally different backgrounds, Francis found George's thuggish lifestyle and cockney leeriness to be amusing and exciting. Another chance to flirt with some kind of danger. George would eventually begin to model for Francis and his art, able to pose for long periods of time for photographs or the occasional rare life painting. He would even earn a handsome sum of money from modelling for his new lover. But as I said briefly earlier, Bacon would eventually weed out something very unflattering from underneath the surface of George Dyer. Something almost completely emasculating, that would increase painting after painting as the months went by. Something driven and inspired by bitter disappointment and near complete contentment of George was now being illustrated by Francis. Why was Francis, the once abused lover, now suddenly becoming the abuser when it came to the newest paintings of the man that he supposedly loved? And that is it for part 3. Thank you so much for watching. I think now that we're 3 episodes in, I'm able to have a clearer picture on how much longer we have left to go. I have a feeling we actually have just one more episode to go. No guarantees, but if you're enjoying this documentary so far, please ensure you subscribe and don't forget to click the bell icon to ensure you're updated on when the next episode is released. Before I go, it's that exciting time again for Artist Corner, where I get to share and discuss some art sent in by one of my viewers. Today's featured artist is Jim Ivers, living in Connecticut, USA. Jim has been illustrating since he was a child, and since then has acquired a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from the San Francisco Academy of Art. All of his work that you can see here is oil on canvas, though Jim does occasionally do watercolors. Professionally, Jim has worked as an editor for many years, and he is currently writing in-depth articles on vintage horror films for Scary Monsters magazine. I find myself drawn to every single one of his paintings, though his piece titled The King Ghost is my favourite. Jim explains it's an illustration of a poem with the same name written by Aleister Crowley, which delves into the concept of unrealised dreams with the figures representing vanity, such as the amphibian creature holding a mirror, politics, religion, and academia, with the failed artist represented as the armadillo-type creature. I love his style of surrealism and bizarre imagery, which nearly always has a dark and unsettling undertone in each piece. There's a haunting nostalgia about them that is distinctive, yet very unique. Jim has no social media or website dedicated to his works, unfortunately, but as I find his paintings so beautifully mysterious, I couldn't help but share his works with you today. If you too are an artist and would like to potentially feature in a video, please send me examples of your art and a bit about yourself to blinddweller@gmail.com, or alternatively you can find and reach me on Twitter. Also, as always, a huge thank you to the following top tier channel members for this month. Classy Chassis, Groufey, who I believe are both new to the channel, so big welcome you two, Wendigo, Ken B, Carol Hartung, and Garrett Greathouse. Thank you for your donations and continued support, guys. If you'd like a shout out in future videos or want to see my content early, please consider becoming a Blind Dweller member today for as little as $2.99 a month. See you all in the next video soon. Bye for now.